Well, join me now, three of the nation's top economic thinkers. Joseph Stiglitz, professor of economics at Columbia University, Nobel Prize winner for economics. Great to have you with us. David K. Johnson, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, formerly the New York Times, author of Free Lunch, How the Wealthiest Americans Enrich Themselves at Government Expense. Talk about timely subtitles, David. Good to have you here. Peter Morici, professor at the Robert H. School of Business at the University of Maryland. Good to have you with us, Professor. Well, let's start with what I would guess every American is thinking right now. Why should I be bailing out foreign banks and investors, CEOs and top executives of Wall Street firms that have been ripping off the system for a very long time? David, would you like to take a shot?
Well, I'm a real skeptic about all of this. We have a system where we've artificially inflated these assets, and they have to come down, and there is no escaping the pain of doing this. And instead of trying to figure out how to perhaps mitigate the pain and deal with it most efficiently and with the least damage, you want to cut off the toes if that's all you have to do, or the leg below the knee, and you don't want to kill the whole patient. They're proposing what? To pump more money in to try and keep these assets inflated? That just doesn't make sense. It may not work, and it could lead to more expenditures like this.
What is striking to me, Professor Stiglitz, is we don't really know the details of this plan right now. There hasn't been a single public hearing. We're talking about a third of the federal deficit, budget, here to be just appropriated apparently at the whim of the Treasury Secretary. Now, Paulson may in some previous life been a smart fellow. He has not behaved as such over the last couple of years. And to have Barney Frank, Chris Dodd, Roy Blunt, and Judge Gregg as the arbiters of what makes sense right now in these times, does this all make sense to you? Should the taxpayer be comforted?
They should be worried. They should be worried. But to go back to your first question, the argument is that unless we do something, the whole house of cards will come down, and the financial system is very important to our economy. You need a flow of credit. The question is,
if I may, if it's so important, why weren't we regulating it? Why weren't we being more measured? And why were we permitting such excess and irresponsibility? I mean,
you're exactly right.
So I accede to the idea that it's important, but I just wonder why it hasn't been treated that way.
Oh, I agree with you. And now, to let the very people who didn't do the regulation, who didn't see the problem coming, all of a sudden they say, trust us, we're the experts. Let us take care of all of this. And don't worry, we know that there's not a lot of details here. We know there's a lot of things that are going to be filled out, but trust us, we're going to be working for you and not for Wall Street. I understand why a lot of people are concerned, quite frankly.
And Professor Morici, for the life of me, Pelosi and Reid making political hay about the politics of fear when talking about the Bush White House, and I think, by the way, that's a pretty good charge against them. They are now they're fellow travelers in the trafficking of fear, and they're not offering anything in the way of a public discussion or transparency about what this money would be used for, what the parameters are of its use, and how it would be effective in dealing with the crisis that they say has a date certain of Monday for absolute climax.
Well, from what they've told us, this thing isn't going to work very well, that's for sure. This was a bipartisan mess in the making, and it seems like they're going to make it worse. It's not going to free up credit. It's not going to break the logjam with regard to businesses getting money. It's going to reward the perpetrators of this mess. It's not going to help middle-class homeowners because it won't lift those asset values as promised. And it's not going to help people in distress very much. I mean, there'll be a little bit of help here and there, but by and large, the big New York banks are going to get $700 billion to play with. That's not a very good thing from where I sit.
Peter is absolutely right. I mean, basically, this is a trickle-down theory once again. You pour money at the top and it's supposed to solve the problem. The problem is the bleeding is at the bottom. The bleeding is the foreclosures. Very little being done about that. The other problem is the banks made loans that were very bad. They've created what we call a hole in the balance sheet. And you don't fix a hole by a shell game. What is needed
Does Washington know anything but shell games? Does Wall Street know anything but shell games here, David?
Well, not for a long time. I mean, think how long we've gone. Every time there's a little dip in the stock market, we have alarm. The government needs to step in and let's let the market do its work. This is a problem that the market will solve. It's going to involve a lot of pain. And by the way, be very skeptical of two things. They're not asking, well, what are the alternatives? Congress hasn't held hearings and said, let's hear from other experts on what to do this. Is there a better, cheaper, or a market way to do it?
There are.
And there are other solutions, Joe, right. And secondly, don't rely on the anecdotal news accounts that this company's having trouble raising money. And I'll give you a good example of the counter anecdote. McClatchy is in the newspaper business, certainly one you don't want to be in these days. They just renegotiated all of their loans, and the terms are not extraordinarily different. Pay attention not to anecdotal stuff, but to fundamentally what's happening in the markets.
In the real economy.
But going back to the real economy, what our economy needs is a stimulus.
Oh my God, how can we need more stimulus? You've written a book called The $3 Trillion War.
Well,
we've got.
This has to work itself out. Stimulus alone isn't going to do it.
Not alone,
but these banks said they wanted the market to regulate them, so now it's time for the market to regulate them. A lot of these banks are badly run. It's not just the subprime loans. It's the whole plethora of activities they've gotten involved in so they can pay themselves these outrageous sums of money. And as a consequence, many of their businesses are in trouble. That's why their stock values are falling so much. It's not just the subprime mess. These banks aren't worth very much right now because they're not very well run.
They're right, but still, there is the fact is our economy is going to slow down. Unemployment is going to increase.
That has happened before in our history.
And
it does happen.
It's important to have, for instance, better unemployment insurance. We have the worst unemployment system
of any of the banks. Well, if we throw $1 trillion at a bailout of Wall Street, wouldn't we be better served to hold that money in reserve for unemployment benefits for those who are going to lose their jobs?
Certainly, we should be having, and the president has threatened to veto a bill to provide better unemployment insurance when he's offering $700 billion to Wall Street. I just don't understand the balance of values and the balance of priorities.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, from your perspective, let me just ask you, if in terms of the leadership here, whether we're talking about the economic leadership, the financial leadership on Wall Street, the political leadership, whether you're talking about McCain, Obama, or Bush, or Pelosi, or Reid, any of them, wouldn't the intelligent thing be, the responsible thing to be for our political leaders, our economic leaders to stand up and say, we have a crisis, and this is going to require sacrifice. And it means, as of right now, we're going to have to change the culture on Wall Street. Excess is ended. Greed is going to be curtailed. We're going to ask each of you who's being saved here to step back and voluntarily give up your compensation because you're fabulously wealthy to begin with. But we're not hearing that discussion. We're not talking about sacrifice. We're talking about more excess, more capital going into a rat hole that is Wall Street. It may not be a hole, but it's filled with rats. So I'm going to call it a rat.
Actually, Lou, we have heard about sacrifice. Paulson gave a speech this winter where he said that, people who are upside down on their mortgages, who owe more than the house is worth, even if they could pay it, they should. They need to sacrifice, he said. This is absolutely absurd. But the people on Wall Street who create less value than they take out in pay, so their banks are failing, they shouldn't sacrifice. Right. Instead, we should give them $700 billion, 5% of GDP. Why, you know how far $700 billion would go to repairing middle America or, making better automobiles, all kinds of things.
You get the last word, David.
Well, I think what we ought to be talking about alternatives. We should be talking about letting the market do its work, and we should be looking at creating a new chapter of the bankruptcy code, because bankruptcy courts are courts that are practical. Allow people to bring in their mortgages to a bankruptcy court, and I think we could inexpensively deal with a lot of this problem very quickly.
That's right. I mean, it's beginning at the bottom, which is the source of the problem, the foreclosures.
Yeah. Well, you talk about it being the bottom. It's where nearly all of middle-class America lives. That's so right. I kind of think, I look at that as the top. It's the rest of these suckers that are in all. Anyway, thank you very much, Professor Morisi. Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. Good to have you with us, David. Thank you very much. We've just heard I think, three of the smartest folks I know in economics, economic public policy, basically say that this government, this Congress, this president, is out of its cotton-picking mind to be going down the path it is. And as we're watching this tick-tock moving and a clock moving closer to a climax that's supposed to come apparently Monday, when they have to turn over $1 trillion of taxpayer money to Wall Street banks. It's crazy. Well,